Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Macbeth, Assistant Professor in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry at Butler University. And today I'm joined by my colleagues, Dr. Chris Stobart from the Department of Biological Sciences at Butler, Dr. Jeremy Johnson, also from the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry, Dr. Chad Knoderer from Department of Pharmacy Practice and College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences, and Dr. Veronica Vernon, also from Pharmacy Practice and College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. And today, we're going to talk to you about the science and safety behind the RNA-based vaccines for the coronavirus causing the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we want to do is clear up some of the terminology and address some myths and misconceptions that you may have heard about this virus. And so first, I'm going to give you a little bit of background in how this virus works and what it contains. And so you may have heard of DNA. DNA is the instruction manual that makes us who we are. And you also may have heard of proteins. And proteins are the products of these instructions. They do all of the work in the cell and in the organism. But the problem is they are written in two different chemical languages, and they need to be translated in order to be understood. And so the chemical language of DNA is different from the chemical language of proteins. And to help translate those instructions, we have a molecule called RNA. This is what RNA does. The DNA that is in the nucleus of our cells is copied into an RNA molecule that's shipped out of the nucleus, where it is then translated into protein. This specific RNA that carries this message is called mRNA, or messenger RNA. And it's the messenger RNA that's present or found in these vaccines. Humans are very complex. They have about 20,000 different messenger RNAs, making about 20,000 different proteins. Coronaviruses are very simple. They only have about 30 different messenger RNAs, making about 30 different proteins. But what's important is the virus needs all of them in order to infect someone and make copies of itself. One of the RNAs that the coronavirus makes carries the instructions for a protein called the spike protein. And as I said, it's the proteins, the product of the DNA that makes us who we are. It's basically the spike protein that is the most prominent feature on the coronavirus. And in fact, the coronavirus is named for a crown because of the crown appearance given by these spike proteins that are on the surface of the virus. And so what does the mRNA vaccine do? So the vaccine that's injected in your arm contains the messenger RNA that carries the instructions for the coronavirus. And that's it. We can't get an infection, a coronavirus infection, because we're missing the other 29 RNAs that are required for the coronavirus to replicate or to make copies of itself. The spike protein without the rest of the virus is also harmless, as is that messenger RNA. The RNA that is injected, it doesn't interact with DNA. It doesn't have those instructions. The RNA that's injected is also very fragile. RNA is unstable and it degrades very quickly, often within hours of getting into your cell. And this is the reason why the vaccines need to be stored at very cold temperatures to keep them stable. And so how does this RNA trigger the immune response? So once it's injected, your cells start making that coronavirus spike protein, and we play a trick on our immune system. We trick the immune system into thinking we actually have a real infection when we don't. We just are making this coronavirus spike protein. So the immune system being tricked like this, it mounts an immune response. The first response is called the innate immune response. It's very rapid. It's also very non-specific, and it's also responsible for a lot of the symptoms we feel when we're first exposed. It might lead to swelling or inflammation, aches and pains, perhaps a fever. These are also the symptoms of the side effects that we feel, and those side effects are basically a signal that this vaccine is working. It's doing its job. You're mounting this immune response against the spike protein. The longer term protection that we get from a vaccine comes from what we call antibodies to the spike protein. These antibodies are made about 2 weeks after injection of the vaccine. These antibodies specifically recognize the spike protein and they protect us by inactivating or neutralizing it. And so if we're ever re-exposed to the virus in the future, our antibodies can directly neutralize the spike protein of the virus that we've been exposed to. In addition, our immune system remembers how to make these antibodies. So further on down the road, if we're ever re-exposed to a coronavirus, we'd be able to make these antibodies very quickly. And so I'm going to turn this over to our panel now and present them with a series of questions. I've broken the questions up into specific categories concerning the science, the safety of the vaccine, and the rollout of the vaccine. And so the first thing that I want to do is address a few terms that we're hearing in the media. And the first one is this concept of herd immunity. Jeremy, can you explain herd immunity and how it will help us beat the pandemic?
Yes, so herd immunity is this term that refers to when a large proportion of a community, called the herd, becomes immune to a disease. What this does is it makes it so that the spread of the disease from one person to another person becomes much more unlikely. And as a result of this, the whole community then becomes protected, not just those who are already immune. In terms of the percentage of a community that needs to develop this immunity, it varies from disease to disease. So the more contagious the disease is, the greater proportion of the population needs to be immune to stop its spread. So for more infectious diseases like measles, it's estimated that about 95% of the population has to be immune. Whereas for polio, this threshold is about 80%. For this particular coronavirus, it's still unknown exactly what it would take to reach this herd immunity. This is a factor that's currently being investigated, but will likely relate to a variety of variables, including the specific communities involved, the vaccination rates, and which populations are vaccinated. For developing this herd immunity, there's two ways we can develop this. So one way is that a large proportion of the population gets infected, and the other way is that we get this protective vaccine. And this vaccine for this coronavirus is really the ideal way to develop this herd immunity. It creates the immunity without causing the illness or resulting complications. It also allows us to protect the populations who can't be vaccinated. So herd immunity and this vaccination is really our collective way to insulate and support these vulnerable populations.
Okay, thank you. Another term that we hear about how well the vaccine works is this term called efficacy. Chad, can you explain what efficacy is and what it means if we have a 95% efficacy for a vaccine?
Sure. The 95% efficacy is the number that you'll hear reported with both the Pfizer and the Mrna mRNA vaccines. And what that says is that the vaccines that are available for use in the US are highly effective. And that's based on those clinical trials that use these vaccines. What the number means itself is that the 95% means that the vaccines decrease the chance of developing infection by around 95% when compared to patients who didn't have the vaccine or didn't receive the vaccine. So if we put this into other words, we can say that the vaccines themselves are 95% effective at preventing infection. And a thing to remember about that number, 95%, that's the efficacy after the second dose. Both of these vaccines require 2 doses. So if we think kind of in pictures, if we think of a graph, what we would expect to see is the infection line for the group of individuals who received placebo would increase over time, compared to the infection line for the group of individuals who received the vaccine would stay relatively flat. So that 95% efficacy number is a really good number. And we will begin to hear, if you haven't already, hear more efficacy data about the vaccines that are up and coming, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine. They will also report high efficacy percentages like Pfizer and Moderna. They may be a little bit lower though, but they're still very good. Another thing to think about along with that efficacy number is the fact that these 2 vaccines that we have available, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine, they keep individuals out of the hospital and they reduce deaths. So we can think of that 95% efficacy number as being a really good number, and it is. But I would also say that we should also remember the efficacy of the vaccines to prevent hospitalizations and deaths, which is a significant complication to health, of course, and in our health systems as well.
Great. Yeah, that clears it up, especially when we see these graphs where, the placebo group's increasing in infections and the vaccine group is basically flat. Yeah, thank you for that. Chris, Chad mentioned we have to get 2 doses. It's only reaches this efficacy after 2 shots. So why do we need 2 doses? And am I going to need to get this shot every year like I get my flu vaccine every year?
Sure. So those are 2 really different questions related to the same concept. The first is about these 2 shots. And as Jeremy mentioned about talking about the herd immunity, the goal here is that you train the immune system to the extent that if you were to ever see the virus again, that you'd be protected, that you wouldn't be able to see an active infection and develop disease. That doesn't mean that you won't catch the virus. It just means it won't cause you disease and enhance mortality, as Chad was talking about. So we have to teach our immune system what the virus looks like. And so with 2 doses, it's 2 chances for your immune system to remember something. So if you're a student watching this video and you're taking classes right now, you're going to more likely do better on the test if you study twice than once. And same thing for immune system, looking at the material, looking at the actual structure of this spike protein, seeing it twice allows your immune system to not only recognize it better, but develop a more quick response against that virus if you do see it. And that's where we see these huge bumps in efficacy with the second dose compared to the first dose. Getting 1 dose of the vaccine will provide some level of protection. Your immune system's seen it, but you'll have a better response with 2 doses. And as a side note, there's some talk right now about people who've already had COVID or have had the disease, COVID-19. They may only need 1 dose instead of 2. And there's been talk about that. And part of that is their immune system's already seen the virus. They've seen it in a natural form. So in those cases, maybe 1 dose is sufficient. But it's hard to know for sure whether you've had the virus or not unless you've had that testing. And we know for sure 2 doses will hit you in that range of 95% efficacy and give your immune system what it needs to respond. Now, with regards to the flu shot and a seasonal flu shot, the real question everyone's asking right now is, okay, let's say we beat this virus down to where it's almost gone on a global level, where we still have a case here and there. Will the virus actually go away? Previous coronaviruses we've had, SARS and MERS, that have caused enhanced disease did go away or have disappeared to non-existent levels. But this virus is in so many people and it infects people so well, it's very likely this is going to persist for a long period of time. And as this virus changes and mutates, we're going to have to potentially get booster shots, just like you do with the annual flu vaccine, to teach your immune system what it looks like now versus what it looked like then, and stay ahead of it.
Great. Chris, I have a quick follow-up. Some of the other vaccines that are in the approval process now, and I think 1 was just approved, only require 1 dose. Can you explain just a little bit about why only 1 dose and how those vaccines might work? Just briefly.
Sure, yeah. So just recently, Johnson & Johnson's vaccine was approved. It's an adenovirus expressing vaccine. It's a totally different setup than what we see with the mRNA-based vaccine. Basically, what scientists did is they took a virus, adenovirus, which is a common virus we see from a monkey. So it's not going to infect humans. Okay, it does not replicate in humans. And they put in, with a little bit of trickery, this spike protein on the surface of this adenovirus. And so the virus looks like a virus. It's covered in the spike protein. So our immune system thinks it's a coronavirus and develops antibodies. And because of other aspects of that viral particle, the immune response we get tends to be a pretty strong response. And it's different than the mRNA-based response. So you only need 1 dose with that regimen because of the amounts of spike that's there and how well you see it versus the mRNA-based approaches. I will say the efficacy is a little bit lower with the 1 dose. I think sometimes they're talking about right now numbers around 66%, still very good compared to, say, the flu vaccine and some other vaccines that have had hit or miss numbers based on how well we're good at predicting these viruses. But you're going to see more of these virus vaccines come out. And that's one type of vaccine. And there's a lot of others in the pipeline. Novavax, AstraZeneca are ones you're seeing in the news right now. And then there's about another 30 or 40 that are in the pipeline behind them of varying forms and different levels of efficacy. The goal here is just training the immune system. And even when we say 66% efficacy, it's important to keep in mind that that's talking about disease and protection. You still might get the infection. You might be in that 33%, 34%. Who don't fall in the classic efficacy protection. You're going to have less disease if you had that vaccine because your immune system did receive some level of protection.
Great. So I'd like to turn the topic over towards the safety or side effects of these vaccines. Chad, can you tell us a little bit about these side effects? What can one expect?
I can, but I would like to follow up just a couple things about efficacy. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine that we've been hearing about, Johnson & Johnson applied for emergency use authorization on the 4th of February. And I don't know when the FDA will decide on that application, but that one is one that hopefully will be available for use. And while it does have lower efficacy than the Pfizer and Moderna, it still is reported to eliminate hospitalizations and deaths. And so that's a really big thing to remember. And that was what Chris was referring to about severity of disease and how well these vaccines work. And I believe that the 2019-2020 flu vaccine was estimated to be about 45% effective. So it provides some context in terms of how these COVID vaccines work relative to a vaccine that we're familiar with. But back to the safety question, thanks for allowing me the detour back to efficacy. But with safety, the vaccines that are available are very safe based on the available data, but no vaccine is without risk. And I'll say first, as a reminder, Mark mentioned this earlier, but neither of the mRNA vaccines contain live virus. And so that's something to remember about these vaccines. And we have a lot of experience from a scientific perspective on the mRNA vaccines themselves as a technology. And the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are the first mRNA vaccines to make it to the market, but these have been around for some time. Individuals who are going to receive either of these vaccines should expect side effects because both of these vaccines can be considered reactogenic. So that means someone who's going to get either one of these vaccines, they're probably going to have some side effects. And the side effects are ones that typically resolve very quickly. The common ones are, the most common is mild to moderate injection, pain around the injection site. And so this is by far the most common, but others that individuals can expect to experience would be some fatigue, maybe low-grade fever, or even some chills, muscle aches related to that injection. Now, a couple of other things to remember about these common side effects. The data that's available suggests that the side effects occur more frequently in younger compared to older recipients, and the second dose generally will lead to more side effects than the first dose. So your first dose, you may have tolerated that pretty good. The data would suggest that you might expect some more side effects after that second dose. Now, safety is going to be something long-term that's followed over time, and there are a couple of different ways that long-term safety is monitored with vaccines. So there's a vaccine adverse event reporting system that can be used to report on and collect information about potential adverse effects, and that will give us a lot more information about long-term effects. The other technology that's out associated with the vaccines is the CDC's VSafe program, which is a smartphone-based application that allows individuals to not only get reminders of when their vaccine is scheduled for, but it also allows them to report if they've experienced any side effects and what those side effects might be. So those are a couple of things that are in place that will allow us to collect a little bit more information about the safety of the vaccines. But bottom line, the adverse effects from the vaccines are far lower than the risks from the COVID disease itself. So the vaccines are a really good way to protect oneself from the disease.
That's a good point, is the risk is much less, and I'd rather have a sore arm than being on a ventilator. So,
yes.
Yep. Okay, Veronica, so some of the hesitancy we hear, people would say that, why shouldn't I just wait for this first phase to sort of go through and see how it goes for everybody before I get vaccinated? What would you say to somebody who made that comment to you?
That's a great question, Mark. And what I would say is that now in the United States, we have vaccinated over 36 million individuals. And we have had no reported deaths. And overall, the side effects, as Chad did a great job describing, have been pretty minor. We're doing about 1.3 million injections per day. We have a lot of evidence that this vaccine is safe. And in the words of Dr. Fauci, if a virus can't replicate, it can't mutate. So you may have heard of some of the mutations of the virus and why this is concerning. So the faster we can get vaccinated, the better this is going to be for all of us in preventing hospitalizations and death and very severe disease. So it is important to get the vaccine when you're offered the vaccine as soon as possible in order to get us all back on a road towards health and wellness and protecting our communities, and especially protecting those who are the most vulnerable and can't get the vaccine, those who may have an allergic reaction or another reason why they can't get it, which I know we're going to cover later. But I think it's really important to know we are giving millions of doses worldwide. We're giving millions of doses, and it's still very, very, very safe. And we're ramping up production of our vaccines every day as we speak.
That's such a great quote from Fauci. I had never heard him say that, but it's terrific. Chris, so you hear about vaccines taking years and years and years to develop. Why was this one developed so quickly? Do we cut corners?
So there's a few factors here. The first one I mentioned earlier, this is not the first coronavirus that's caused disease in humans. It's actually the 7th known human coronavirus. 4 cause a common cold. And probably everyone watching this has had at least one of those coronaviruses before. They circulate, they cause 15% of cases of the common cold. They're just like the flu virus. They come and go during the winter season, and they're not uncommon. Then there was Sarge Coronavirus, which is actually where the namesake for this one came from. SARS-CoV-2 is the name of the virus that's causing COVID-19. It's named that because it very closely resembles SARS-CoV. And that's important to keep in mind with the timeline here. People started making vaccines for SARS coronavirus after it emerged in 2002 and 2003. So we already had a head start. We had technology being developed and approaches being developed for the previous coronavirus, and we just need to tweak it a little bit, and we had it ready to go for this virus. So first of all, when we talk about timeline, we didn't start this really a year ago when this virus emerged. We started it a decade ago when SARS coronavirus emerged. And what we did is we tweaked existing technologies with what was known about the virus, these coronaviruses, and this spike protein, all coronaviruses have the spike protein, and they have very similar structures. So people have been studying spike protein for 30 or 40 years. Now, the timeline here was the fastest we've had, but you've got the entire world working together right now to accelerate this process and go as fast as possible. The coronavirus community before COVID-19 was probably on the order of hundreds of scientists. Now we're on the order of tens of thousands of scientists, which makes it difficult for me to try to get grant funding because everyone's working on coronaviruses right now. But that's good because everyone's working together and we're pooling all this technology. And the technology we have today, these mRNA vaccines, are really cool from a science perspective, being able to do this. And they work really well. And so that's why the timeline has been what it is. We were able to turn this around so quickly. When the entire world works together and the scientific community is working together with the public health community, with the clinicians, with our community experts, We're moving things faster than we've had before. But believe me, we're not cutting corners. We're just building, and we're gaining steam by the concerted effort of everybody here, rather than just a few little changes and tweaks that it may appear to be. We're actually putting a lot behind this. There's been a lot behind this before. So when they say, oh, well, it took a year to make this vaccine, that is light speed compared to other vaccines, but it's not unprecedented when you look at when we really started the conceptual design of this vaccine a decade ago.
Yeah, I the past year, as someone who has a research lab, I'm always blown away just by the sheer volume of papers that are published on coronavirus and the biology and biochemistry of this. So yeah, it is moving very fast, but it is this concerted effort. Thank you. Chad, let's say I tested positive for COVID-19. I had the coronavirus, tested positive for the virus. Should I still get the vaccine, or can I still get the vaccine?
Yes, the short answer is yes. Individuals who have tested positive for the virus should get the vaccine, but there are a couple things to think about. The first thing to think about is that the vaccine will not prevent disease after recent exposure. So if you were recently exposed, then you should continue your isolation and quarantine period, and then you can get the vaccine once that period is over and once you've been cleared from that isolation. So remembering that the vaccine itself is not going to prevent disease after immediate exposure to the virus. Now, reinfection in those who have had exposure to the virus is relatively rare, I believe within 90 days. So in our current state where we have demand outpacing supply, there is a consideration for those who have had infection with virus that they can maybe wait for a little bit to get their vaccine, given that reinfection rate within that 90-day window. So that's also a consideration there to think about. But the bottom line is that individuals who've had the virus and have had disease, they're expected to benefit from the vaccine, and they should get the vaccine. There's some considerations about timing and when to do that, but the bottom line is yes, they should.
Veronica, is there anyone that shouldn't get the vaccine, or are there recommendations for some folks that should not get it if there's a comorbidity, or if they're children or pregnant, or who should not get it?
A great question. And really, who shouldn't get the vaccine are those that have had an allergic reaction to a component of the vaccine. That's really the only group that should not receive the vaccine. So really for the mRNA vaccines, we're worried about those who've had an allergic reaction to polyethylene glycol. It's what we use in the mRNA vaccines. Polysorbate is another product that we should be concerned about if you've had an allergic reaction to. It's not in the vaccine, but it's closely related to polyethylene glycol. So really, if you've had an anaphylactic reaction, that's you have difficulty breathing, your throat closes up, and it's a life-threatening emergency, you shouldn't receive the vaccine, at least the specific vaccine that you've had the reaction to. But if you have diabetes, heart disease, COPD, you definitely should get the vaccine because you're at a much higher risk of severe disease from the virus, and those patients definitely should get it. With regards to pregnant and breastfeeding women or lactating patients, I get this question quite frequently. And my recommendation is to talk it over with your healthcare provider, but I do recommend that those groups get the vaccine. And it's because pregnant women are at a higher risk of severe illness from the virus. And we think that giving them the vaccine is going to be much safer than getting the complications from the virus and from the infection. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the Society of Maternal and Fetal Medicine, and the American Society for Reproductive Medicine all recommend that the vaccine be offered to pregnant women and also to patients who are lactating or breastfeeding. Some exciting evidence that's coming out about breastfeeding women is that we are detecting antibodies in milk from patients who have received the vaccine. And we think that those can be passed on to babies, which is really exciting. And so I recommend it. And we do know that especially with the mRNA vaccine, we have a little bit more thought process behind that since those vaccines came out first. If it does pass through to breast milk, it's not likely to have an adverse effect on the infant. So I do recommend pregnant and breastfeeding women definitely talk to your healthcare provider, but my personal opinion is to get it if you're offered.
I'm going to steer the conversation to some what happens after we get a vaccine. Let's say you've gotten a shot, and my first question is for Jeremy. Once you receive it, can you still transmit it to somebody? And or do we still need to wear masks and keep our distances? So what happens afterwards?
I know this is a really common question. So as we've talked about so far about how the vaccines work, right, what a vaccine's really doing is it's priming your immune system to be able to combat, future infections, and it's training your body to successfully fight off the virus so you don't get really sick from it. Because of this, what most vaccines do is they produce what's known as effective immunity, which prevents a virus from causing serious disease, but it doesn't really stop it from entering your body or from making at least a small number of copies of itself. At the moment, what researchers studying this coronavirus are saying is their best guess is that vaccines will reduce transmission, but may not prevent it entirely. The evidence suggests that the vaccines cut the transmission, but they don't eliminate it. There have been actually multiple large studies by Moderna, Pfizer, many of the companies doing these vaccinations to try to determine if their vaccinations prevent transmission. This is a really important question because if vaccinated people are still silent spreaders of the virus, this will increase that threshold required for that herd immunity that we talked about. However, right, because of this sort of transmission of the virus, this indicates that the precautions we're all taking, like wearing masks, social distancing, washing our hands, avoiding crowded spaces, right, that unfortunately we still have to do these things until the country gets much closer to this herd immunity. Right. The good news is that the preliminary evidence indicates that the vaccination does significantly reduce these transmission levels. So keep wearing your masks, keep doing these things, but the vaccinations are certainly moving us towards reducing those.
Great. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, keep your masks on for the near term anyway. So. Chris, what is after I've gotten my 2 doses of the RNA vaccine, what is the timeline for immunity and how long will I be protected for?
Yep, so there's actually a few factors here. If I could just add one thing with what Jeremy was talking about, just kind of support what he was saying there. The country that's leading the world right now in terms of the vaccination campaigns is Israel. And they're starting to see reduced transmission in their population. I think they vaccinated 40% of their population now. And I think that is evidence that this vaccination campaign, the goal, vaccinating and trying to establish herd immunity, does work. We're seeing the data, and they're just showing you what hopefully we'll be seeing as we get closer to that herd immunity level as well. So, but going back to the question about immunity and how long is this going to last, we really don't know exactly how long you'll have immunity from the vaccine, but what I can tell you based on prior vaccines and exposure to these levels of antigen, certainly we're talking probably in the order of a couple to a few years, assuming that the virus doesn't change sufficiently to the point where you can no longer recognize it. And so, we've got 2 contrasting problems. We got how long are you protected against the current vaccine? Remember, when you see your immune system sees this, it's like taking a photo of the virus at that moment in time. But the virus now puts on a bald cap and grows out facial hair, will your immune system still recognize it, right? And that's really what we're talking about here is it's mutating, it's adapting, it's changing its appearance a little bit, and your immune system's based on what you saw in the past. So, there's a lot of talk right now about, are we going to need boosters? Are we going to need another version of the vaccine that's slightly tweaked to train it now what it looks like versus what it did look like? And it's very likely we may have that. But I would say if we were guessing right now based on the past history and our history of immunizations and the persistence of immunologic memory, protection afforded by those, we're probably looking on an order of a year or 2 minimum protection once you get this 2-dose regimen. And if we're effective at distributing the vaccine like we're talking about, that may be enough to hit herd immunity before the concern about mutations and changes reduces our protection levels back down to the point where this virus could have a comeback.
A couple of years, hopefully. And and so I'm glad you brought up these new strains, right? And so you hear about them, and you know, how much should we be afraid of those? And will the vaccines cover these new variants of the virus? Jeremy, do you have any ideas about that?
So we've certainly been hearing a lot about these in the news. You hear names like, you know, the UK strain or the South African strain or the Brazilian. They all have scientific names that go with them, but I'll sort of refer to them by those general names that we've heard around. Unfortunately, right, as a scientist, you know, I have to be honest that there's not a large amount of information available at the moment about how the vaccines, especially the mRNA vaccines, are at combating these emerging strains. Most of that's because the clinical trials were completed before most of these strains emerged. You know, the preliminary results we do have, which I have to put in the caveat, have not been peer-reviewed or published. Right? What they suggest is that the vaccines are likely to still provide protection against the majority of these variants, but there might be some difference depending on the relative variants. You know, at the moment, the studies that have been done, they take blood from patients or antibodies from patients who've been immunized or recovered, and then they test them for their relative response to some of these variants. So for like the UK variants, the scientists at Pfizer, Moderna, they took these what are called neutralizing antibodies, and they found that they were just as good at targeting the UK variant as they are at the sort of strains that they were originally trained against. However, right, what they found for the South African variant was that, you know, the antibody levels was about 1/6 the level of response as the original response to the original virus. However, right, we don't know whether that 1/6 level is enough in order to lead to the immune response required in order to combat the virus. I'd sort of echo some of the things that Chris said, right? One real advantage of these particular new types of vaccines, especially the mRNA ones, is that they can be more rapidly designed to target these new variants with vaccine boosters. And you know, both of these companies have said they're already working on these. And you know, we've talked about the flu vaccine. You know, this would be very similar to how the flu vaccine, a new version is developed every year based on the currently circulating versions of that particular virus. You know, from a practical perspective, you know, the discovery of these variants doesn't change the basic recommendation of vaccination. It's not recommended that people wait for a new or changed vaccine in the hopes that it'll be more effective against these new variants. Instead, right, what we should all do is we should get vaccinated to reduce the overall transmission, and this will move us towards that herd immunity.
And I was having a conversation with Chris earlier this week. It's just, you know, almost certainly these companies are starting to develop these boosters already. They have the RNA sequences. They're making these vaccines already for this next round of boosters. Yeah. And I believe these variants with these mutations, they're called escape mutations, right, Chris? So it's like they put on their disguise, their, you know, their glasses and their hat, and so escape immunity.
Exactly. Yeah, if I can just add just one quick thing. So these mutations that we're hearing about, it's not uncommon for viruses to mutate, right? That's the nature of a virus. That's how it evolves and adapts. So we're going to hear about more escape mutants over the next few months. I mean, you're going to hear about new variants, new versions that pop up, and that's not unsurprising. The ones that are concerning us and the ones that you're hearing about right now are those that have variations in the spike protein where our immune system recognizes it. Right. So again, it's literally looking at the face of the virus and it's changing its appearance in real time. And will your antibodies, your immune system recognize it? And that's exactly what this is talking about. So that South African variant sits right in the spot where your antibody binds the spike protein. And that's why we're seeing that effect potentially.
Okay, we'll wind this down and talk about the availability of the vaccine or obligations to get the vaccine. And the first question is for Chad. Do you think there's ever going to be a mandate for the vaccine, either a local or employer or even a federal mandate to get the vaccine?
That's a good question, and I think one that people might be thinking about. You know, states and employers and schools can certainly require vaccines as a condition of employment or entering school, for example, and many do. if we think about organizations that require annual flu shots for employees, I know several of the my colleagues are required to get an annual flu shot to perform their job in the hospital, for example. And of course, there are exemptions for medical or religious reasons that are certainly provided in instances. I think it's at this point a little bit premature to start thinking about that because our demand for the vaccine still outpaces supply. So when we're in an era where we have plenty of supply to go around, it's a little bit easier, for lack of a better term, to start thinking about those mandates or requirements. All that said, I don't think that the COVID vaccine would be handled any differently than flu vaccine, for example, once we're at a place where we have plenty of supply. But at this point, it's probably premature to think about that.
As faculty, do any of you sort of suggest that your students get it? You suggest it to your class? I do.
I do.
Oh, yeah.
I do. Our students have been getting it being healthcare professional
yeah.
students.
Sure.
And I just talked to all of them this week about it actually in class.
So I'm glad you brought that up, Veronica. So when can I get mine? What's the timeline for the rollout? It's like I'm waiting here impatiently to get it. So I don't want to say I'm dying to get it, but yes, I am.
Yes, you probably are. Well, I would love to be able to tell you an exact date. I've been working with the state on their rollout plan, and that's hard to pin down right now when the general public or when educators are going to be available to get it. We're working through the phased program. So each state was instructed by the federal government to come up with their own plan. They had to have their plan submitted in October. So months ago now, we received our first vaccine shipment in December. Indiana's already vaccinated about 9% of the population. So we're actually one of the better states. We're about middle of the pack, but still one of the better states in terms of using our vaccine allotment. And each state is getting a different vaccine allotment. And some weeks we're not getting as much as we were promised. So it can be a little bit frustrating. And like you've heard before, demand is definitely outpacing supply right now. So what Indiana's plan focused on was vaccinating healthcare professionals and students first, as they're likely to be at the greatest risk of being exposed to the virus. Then we went to the groups that are at the greatest risk of hospitalization and death, and that would be those that are 65 years of age and older. So we started with 80 and older, 70 and older, and then this past week we've gone up to 65 and older can receive the vaccine. So our hope then we get through the groups that are the most vulnerable, then we can open it up to those who are younger with coexisting conditions such as diabetes, heart disease, and then educators hopefully will be in one of the coming next rounds. Good news is we're starting to see the federal government utilize pharmacies. So previously the vaccines were just being shipped to hospitals because of, especially the Pfizer vaccine had to be stored at ultra cold temperatures. Now we're seeing with more vaccines being approved that don't have those storage requirements, pharmacies are going to be used, which you probably can think of a pharmacy very close to where you live. And so our hope then is we can use more of our vaccine supply, reach more of the population, and as states use up their vaccine supply, they get more vaccine. So hopefully soon is our hope, and we're hoping to get more vaccine, and the manufacturers are ramping up their production as we speak.
Also, Veronica, I'm going to give you the last word. The last question we have here. When is it going to be over, and when are things going to be back to normal? Are they ever? And I'm pretty sure that we're all, at our wits' end with this. So
I think it's going to be a new normal. I think we've learned a lot through this pandemic. I think we've learned to be adaptive and creative and really resilient. I tell my students, this has restored my faith in humanity, even though this has been terrible for all of us to go through. I think just how much we've all worked together. I think our students have shown such great resilience in the classroom, doing hybrid and online, and I think they've adapted even better than I have some days. Our hope is that, this year we'll get through it. We get increased vaccine production. The sooner you can get vaccinated, the sooner things can go back to normal, at least a new normal, where we can see each other, see colleagues, and that's my hope. But it's hard to tell when that's going to be. But the sooner we all get vaccinated, the better. I can say that with extreme certainty.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to bring that to a close. I'd just like to once again thank all of my colleagues for sharing their knowledge and their expertise. Dr. Stobart, Jeremy Johnson, Drs. Veronica, Vernon, and Chad Knoderer. Again, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it. It was incredibly informative. And I hope for everyone that's watching, we've not only sort of changed their minds or changed this hesitancy to downright enthusiasm to getting the vaccine, because it is what is going to help us beat this pandemic. And I do think we all have to do our part. So thank you again for all participating in this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.